The starship Aurora drifted silently in the endless expanse of space, a gleaming vessel against the backdrop of distant stars. Its sleek metal hull shimmered faintly in the ambient starlight, its reflective surface a testament to human engineering and ambition. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Commander Reland Thorne stood in front of the massive viewport, gazing out into the abyss. His reflection stared back at him, tall, strong, and focused, yet with an unease that even the vastness of space couldn't quell. This mission was unlike anything he'd ever encountered in his years of service with the Galactic Diplomatic Corps. The mission briefing had been clear, but the implications were anything but straightforward. Behind him, a soft hum indicated the presence of Lieutenant Jane Kavanaugh, his second in command, who entered the observation deck with her usual brisk steps. She was a no-nonsense officer, known for her precision and sharp mind. Yet even she had been unusually quiet since the briefing. She approached him with a datapad in hand, her expression neutral but her eyes betraying a hint of concern. "Sir," she began, her voice steady, "we've received confirmation from the HFY. They're ready to initiate first contact protocols." Reland nodded, his gaze still fixed on the stars. "I expected as much," he replied, though his voice was distant. His mind was elsewhere, already envisioning the encounter ahead. The HFY, a mysterious and reclusive alien race, had been the subject of speculation for years. Their ships had appeared on the outskirts of human space almost 2 decades ago, hovering on the edge of communication but never fully engaging. They were known for their advanced telepathic abilities and a culture rooted in concepts of unity and collective consciousness, something entirely foreign to the fiercely individualistic humans. The Galaxy Council had been eager to establish peaceful relations, and now, after years of patience, the HFY had finally agreed to formal talks. But the terms of the mission were unusual. The HFY had requested a representative, someone they could connect with on a deeper, more personal level. Diplomatic contact, they said, could only be established through a bond that transcended words, a mental and emotional connection far beyond the formal exchanges Ryland was used to. That's why Ryland had been chosen. His record was impeccable, 12 successful first contact scenarios, his expertise in alien psychology making him a top candidate. Yet none of those previous encounters had prepared him for this. The HFY weren't just looking for a meeting or a treaty, they were seeking something more intimate, something that made the usual diplomatic courtesies seem irrelevant. "Do you think it's wise?" Sir Lieutenant Kavanaugh asked, breaking the silence as she stepped closer. "To send only you?" Reland finally turned away from the viewport, meeting her gaze. "It's not about wisdom, Jane," he said, his voice calmer now, though the weight of the mission was evident in his tone. "It's about necessity. They made it clear only one can go. Only one will be allowed to establish the connection." "But no one knows what this connection really entails," she pressed, her brow furrowing. "There's been speculation, rumors. Even the intelligence reports are vague at best." He appreciated her concern, but the decision had already been made. "Speculation doesn't help us," he replied, his expression firm. "We've been waiting for this moment for years. The HFY are a potential ally too valuable to ignore. Whatever they need from me, I'll give it. It's my duty." Kavanaugh sighed, her hand tightening around the datapad. "I know, sir. It's just..." Reland gave her a reassuring smile. "I'll be fine. They wouldn't have agreed to this if there was danger involved. They've been careful all this time, staying distant. Now, they've decided to let us in." She nodded, though the concern didn't leave her eyes. "Understood, sir. If something feels off, don't hesitate to abort. We need you to come back." He gave a soft chuckle, appreciating the loyalty she always showed. "I'll keep that in mind." With that, Lieutenant Kavanaugh stepped back and left the observation deck, leaving Ryland alone once more with his thoughts. His eyes returned to the viewport, where the stars continued their slow dance. Somewhere out there, just beyond the reach of his gaze, lay the HFY vessel, the ship that had sent out the invitation for this unprecedented meeting. The HFY ship had docked with the Aurora hours ago, but there had been no physical contact yet. No boarding, no formal greeting, just a request for Ryland to approach alone when they were ready. He had been briefed on what little was known about their physiology and culture, though most of it was theory, gathered from distant observations. Their telepathic abilities, however, were not theory. Reland had experienced it himself during the initial stages of contact. The brief flashes of thought, the subtle hints of emotions that had invaded his mind. He wasn't unaccustomed to alien minds, but this was different. It was less of an invasion and more of a caress, soft, like a hand brushing against his consciousness, testing him, measuring his responses. He wasn't afraid, but he was undeniably anxious. There was something deeply personal about this mission. It wasn't just about human diplomacy anymore. It was about him, his thoughts, his feelings, his very mind. And the HFY were watching. A soft chime echoed through the observation deck, followed by the smooth, synthesized voice of the ship's AI. Commander Thorne, the HFY have confirmed their readiness. You are requested to proceed to docking Bay 3. This was it. Raylan took a deep breath, his muscles tensing momentarily before he forced them to relax. He had faced far more dangerous missions than this. Battles, tense negotiations, even a hostage crisis on Centauri Prime. But this was new, and with newness came uncertainty. He made his way down the pristine white corridors of the Aurora, his boots tapping rhythmically against the metal floor. Crew members gave him nods of acknowledgement as he passed, though none of them truly knew the details of his mission. In fact, most didn't even know about the HFY docking. Secrecy was paramount, given the fragile nature of the contact. The fewer people involved, the better. As he approached docking Bay 3, Raylan's heart began to beat faster. The large doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the vast, sterile space of the docking area. And there, shimmering in the dim lighting, stood the portal between his ship and the HFY vessel, a sleek, dark tunnel that seemed to hum with energy. Raylan hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. The doors of the HFY craft opened with a near-silent motion, revealing a chamber bathed in soft, blue light. As he crossed the threshold, the ambient sound of the Aurora vanished, replaced by a strange, calming silence. The air here was cooler, laced with a scent he couldn't quite place, something metallic, but not unpleasant. His boots made no sound as they touched the floor of the HFY ship, and as he stepped into the chamber, he saw her. Zura. She stood in the center of the room, tall and imposing, yet with a grace that was almost hypnotic. Her skin was a deep silver, and faint patterns of light shifted across her body, marking her emotions. Her eyes, large and violet, fixed on him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You've come," her voice spoke directly into his mind, a presence that filled him with an unexpected warmth. There was no hostility, only curiosity. Raylan nodded, his voice steady but softer than he intended. "Yes, I'm here." She stepped forward, her movements fluid, each step seemingly calculated to perfection. There was no hostility in her demeanor, but the weight of her gaze was enough to make Raylan feel exposed, vulnerable. He realized with a start that she was already beginning to read him, his thoughts, his emotions. "You are different," Zura observed, her mental voice soft yet probing. "Your mind is open yet guarded." Raylan stiffened slightly, trying to keep his thoughts under control. "I've been trained to protect my thoughts." She smiled then, a small, delicate gesture that softened the sharp lines of her face. "You will not need that here. We must connect, Commander. Let down your guard." He swallowed, feeling the intensity of her presence growing as she stepped closer, her telepathic influence brushing against the edges of his consciousness. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a connection deeper than words, more profound than any conversation. And in that moment, he realized that this mission was going to test him in ways he had never imagined. The connection had begun, and there was no turning back. The air inside the HFY vessel felt different the moment Commander Raylan Thorne crossed the threshold. It wasn't just the temperature, which was cooler than that of the Aurora. It was something more subtle, almost imperceptible. A sensation that crept up the back of his neck, making his skin prickle with awareness. The atmosphere was charged with an energy he couldn't define, yet it tugged at his senses, drawing him deeper into the ship's mysterious interior. The soft, ambient blue light emanating from the walls cast long shadows as Raylan moved down the corridor. His footsteps were muffled, as if the very ship absorbed sound, muting every noise and creating an eerie stillness. The walls themselves seemed alive, the smooth surfaces pulsing faintly with a rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat. It was disorienting, as though the ship itself was breathing, watching, waiting, and so was she. He couldn't see her yet, but Raylan felt her presence. Zura, the HFY representative, was close. He had studied her dossier in the hours leading up to this moment, but nothing in those reports, nothing in the diagrams or the scant information they had on her species could have prepared him for this. The connection between the HFY and their ships was something deeper than human technology could replicate. They didn't just pilot their vessels, they lived within them, formed a bond that was as much emotional as it was technical. Raylan wondered if Zura could feel his presence the way he could sense hers. He rounded a corner, and there she was, standing alone in the center of a large circular chamber. The room was expansive, its ceiling high and arched, the walls adorned with shifting patterns of light. It felt almost sacred, like stepping into a temple. And Zura was the goddess that ruled over it. She stood taller than any human woman he had ever seen, her frame slender but strong, radiating a quiet power. Her skin, a soft silver, shimmered with faint iridescent hues as the lights from the room danced across her. The patterns etched into her skin delicate lines and swirls that seemed to shift with her emotions glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the rhythmic hum of the ship. Her face was striking, with high cheekbones and eyes that dominated her features large, almond-shaped, and violet, glowing with an intensity that pierced through him the moment their gazes met. For a brief moment, Rylan felt as if he had forgotten how to breathe. There was something both unsettling and captivating about her. She wasn't just beautiful in the conventional sense, her beauty was alien, otherworldly, something that defied human comprehension. And yet, beneath that strange elegance, there was a familiarity, a softness in her expression that beckoned him closer. Commander Rylan Thorne, her voice echoed softly in his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. There was no delay, no pause for the translation devices. It was as if her thoughts had simply become his. "You've come as expected." He nodded, forcing himself to steady his breath. "Zura," he replied, the sound of his own voice surprisingly loud in the quiet chamber. "It's an honor to finally meet you." Her lips quirked into the smallest of smiles, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed had he not been staring. "I've heard many things about you, Commander," she continued, her voice still flowing through his mind, smooth and gentle, yet layered with curiosity. "You are the one they have chosen to represent your people in the connection." The way she said connection made Rylan's pulse quicken. He had been briefed on the concept of deep mental and emotional link the Svari used to communicate and bond with other beings. It was a sacred ritual for them, one that could not be entered into lightly. The Galactic Diplomatic Corps had stressed that the connection was more than a mere exchange of thoughts. It was a melding of minds, a sharing of everything, from surface thoughts to the most intimate emotions. Rylan wasn't sure he was ready for that. But he had to be. For humanity, for the mission. And for whatever lay ahead. "I'm here to establish that connection," he said, standing taller, meeting her gaze with resolve. "We both know how important this is." Zura tilted her head slightly, her violet eyes narrowing as if she was studying him, measuring him. "Yes, the importance is clear," she murmured, her voice almost like a caress in his mind. "But are you prepared? Are you truly ready for what the connection demands of you?" The question lingered in the air between them, and Rylan hesitated for just a fraction of a second. He had been trained for this, yes. But could anyone truly be ready to open their minds so fully, to strip away every defense, every barrier, and allow another being to see into the deepest corners of their soul? "I am ready," he said, his voice firm, though the tension in his body betrayed the uncertainty he tried to hide. "Whatever it takes." Zura's smile deepened, just enough to be noticeable now. She took a slow step toward him, her movements fluid, as though the air itself parted for her. There was no sound as her feet touched the floor, no disturbance in the stillness of the chamber. She was like a specter, ethereal and otherworldly. "I sense your resolve," she said, her voice flowing through him like a warm current. "But I also sense your fear." She stopped just a few feet in front of him, her gaze locked on his. "Do not worry, Rylan. Fear is natural. It is part of who you are. It is part of why I was chosen to meet with you." He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "You can sense that?" She nodded, her violet eyes softening, though they remained intense. "I can feel the edges of your mind already. It is like standing on the shore of a great ocean, looking out over its surface, but knowing there are depths beneath that remain unseen." The analogy struck Rylan with an unexpected force. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed, even in the most high-pressure situations. But now, standing before Zura, he felt as though he was standing on the precipice of something vast and unknowable, something that terrified him and thrilled him in equal measure. "And what do you see on that surface?" he asked, his voice quieter now, the bravado slipping away. Zura's expression softened even further, and for the first time since he had arrived, Rylan saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "I see strength," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper in his mind. "And I see loneliness." The words hit him harder than he expected. Loneliness. It was a word he rarely used to describe himself, but deep down he knew it was true. His career had taken him to the farthest reaches of space, placing him in situations where he was often the only human for light years. He had grown used to the isolation, used to the silence. But hearing Zura speak it so plainly, so gently, made it real in a way that he hadn't been ready for. "How? How can you tell?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Zura took another step forward, her presence filling the space around him. "Because I know what it is to be alone," she replied, her voice heavy with emotion. "My people live in connection with one another, our minds always linked, our thoughts shared. But I am different. I am here, far from my home, far from my people. And like you, I know the weight of solitude. Raylan felt his chest tighten. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to reveal something so personal so quickly. The reports had described the Sci-Fi as distant, emotionless beings, focused solely on their collective consciousness. But here, standing before him, Zura was something else entirely. She wasn't just a representative of her people, she was an individual with thoughts, feelings, and vulnerabilities. We're not so different, then he said, his voice softer now, more genuine. No, Zura agreed, her gaze never leaving his. We are not. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of the unspoken connection between them growing heavier with each passing second. Rylan could feel the walls around his mind beginning to soften, the defenses he had built over years of training slowly crumbling. It wasn't something he had expected, but it was happening, whether he was ready or not. Zura took another step closer, until she was standing directly in front of him. He could feel the warmth of her presence, the faint hum of energy that seemed to radiate from her. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from his face, her long, slender fingers trembling slightly. May I, she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper in his mind. Rylan hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yes. Her hand moved forward, her fingertips brushing lightly against his temple. The touch was delicate, barely more than a feather's caress, but the moment her skin touched his, Rylan felt a rush of warmth flood through him. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was something deeper, something that reached into his very soul. And then the connection began. It was like nothing he had ever experienced. His mind opened, his thoughts spilling out like water from a broken dam. He could feel Zura's presence flooding into him, her thoughts intertwining with his, her emotions washing over him in waves. He could see her memories, fleeting images of her world, her people, her life. And in return, she saw him as past, his fears, his hopes. The connection was overwhelming, but it wasn't painful. It was intimate, raw, and powerful. Rylan could feel the depth of Zura's emotions, her loneliness, her longing for connection. And she could feel his desire to bridge the gap between their species, his need to understand, to be understood. For what felt like an eternity, they stood there, their minds intertwined, their souls laid bare. There were no secrets, no lies, just the pure, unfiltered truth of who they were. When Zura finally withdrew her hand, the connection lingered between them, a bond that couldn't be broken. You are ready, she whispered, her voice filled with quiet certainty. Rylan nodded, his heart still racing, his mind still reeling from the intensity of the experience. Yes, he replied softly, meeting her gaze once more. So are you. They had taken the first step. And there was no turning back. The silence in the small chamber was almost deafening. Commander Rylan Thorne sat motionless in his assigned quarters aboard the Sci-Fi vessel, staring at the curved walls as if they might reveal some hidden answer to the questions swirling in his mind. He had already been aboard for nearly 24 hours, but time had lost its meaning. The weight of what was to come pressed down on him with a gravity he hadn't expected. He hadn't spoken to Zura since their first meeting in the circular chamber. The connection they had shared in that brief moment had left him feeling exposed in a way no battle or interrogation ever had. It wasn't fear that twisted in his gut now, it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. And it grew stronger with each passing minute. The room, like everything else on the Sci-Fi vessel, was alien in design yet oddly comforting. The walls seemed to glow with a soft, pulsating light, casting a warm, ethereal ambience that was at once soothing and unsettling. There were no sharp corners, no hard edges. Everything flowed, curving seamlessly, as if the ship itself was alive, breathing around him. It was hard to ignore the sensation that the very walls were watching him, as if the ship shared the same connection with its inhabitants. And soon he would be part of that connection. The thought made his heart race. He had trained for this mission for months, undergone countless psychological evaluations, spent hours reading up on the Sci-Fi culture, trying to understand their ways, their beliefs. But none of that could prepare him for the reality of it. Nothing could prepare him for Zura. Rylan exhaled, his breath shuddering slightly as he tried to regain control of his emotions. He was a soldier, a commander who had faced countless battles, negotiated tense standoffs, and survived situations that would have broken most people. And yet, here he was, sitting in the dim light of an alien ship, feeling more vulnerable than he ever had in his life. The door to his quarters slid open with a soft, nearly imperceptible hiss, and Rylan's body tensed instinctively. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The energy in the room shifted immediately, and he felt her presence before she even spoke. Rylan. Zura's voice was soft, a gentle whisper in the quiet space, but it carried the weight of everything that lay ahead. Her voice wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, wrapping itself around his thoughts, pulling him toward her without him even realizing it. He turned slowly to face her, and there she stood in the doorway, her tall, graceful frame bathed in the soft light from the walls. Her silver skin shimmered faintly, the intricate lines and patterns etched into her flesh glowing with a soft, pulsing light. Her violet eyes, those mesmerizing, otherworldly eyes, locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, stepping further into the room with a fluid grace that seemed effortless. Her movements were so smooth, so perfectly controlled, that it was almost like watching a dream unfold. But I felt she paused, her head tilting slightly as if she was searching for the right word. "I felt your uncertainty." Raylan swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how exposed he was in her presence. There was no point in lying, she could sense it. The connection between them, though barely formed, was already starting to take shape, pulling them closer in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying. "I guess I'm just trying to wrap my head around everything," he admitted, his voice low. "This mission, the connection." The last word slipped out before he could stop it, but it hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Zura smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips that softened her otherwise sharp features. "You are not the first to feel overwhelmed by the thought of connection," she said, her voice laced with understanding. "It is a daunting thing to open yourself so completely, to allow another to see every part of who you are." She moved closer to him, her steps soundless against the smooth floor, and Rylan felt a strange pull deep in his chest, like a magnet drawing him toward her. Her presence was intoxicating, like gravity itself had shifted, and all he could do was follow. "But it is also a beautiful thing," she continued, her voice soft but firm. "It is not just about exposing weakness. It is about understanding strength. Yours, mine, and how they can be woven together." Her words settled over him like a blanket, wrapping him in a warmth that he hadn't expected. There was no judgment in her tone, no impatience, just a quiet acceptance of what was to come. Rylan stood slowly, feeling the weight of his body as he rose to face her. He was tall by human standards, but Zura was taller still, and when they stood face to face, he had to tilt his head slightly to meet her gaze. The proximity made his heart race, his pulse pounding in his ears, but he refused to look away. "I know this is important," he said, his voice steadying as he found his resolve. "For our people, for the future of our alliance. I want to understand Zura. I want to make this work." Zura's eyes softened, the violet depths shimmering with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "It will work," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But you must let go of the need to control it. The connection cannot be forced. It must be allowed." Her words stirred something deep inside him, something primal and ancient. Raylan had always been a man of action, someone who thrived on control and precision. But this was different. This wasn't something he could command or fight. It was something he had to surrender to. "Close your eyes," Zura said softly, stepping even closer until he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. Raylan hesitated for only a moment before doing as she asked. The darkness behind his eyelids was immediate, but it wasn't empty. He could feel her presence all around him, like the hum of electricity in the air, buzzing just beneath the surface. "Breathe," she whispered, and he realized he had been holding his breath. Slowly, he exhaled, the tension in his body loosening as he let the air out. Her hand brushed against his, the lightest touch, but it sent a ripple of warmth through him that spread from his fingertips to the core of his being. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was something more, something deeper. He could feel her, not just her touch, but her emotions, her thoughts, as if they were threading themselves through his own. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice echoing in his mind now, as if they were no longer speaking aloud. "Yes," he breathed, his voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't know how to describe what he was feeling. It was like standing on the edge of an abyss, looking down into the unknown, and yet there was no fear, only anticipation. Zura's hand moved up to his temple, her fingers light and delicate, tracing the curve of his skull, as if she was drawing something out of him. "Let go," she whispered. "Let me in." Raylan's heart pounded in his chest, but he did as she asked. He let go of the control he had clung to for so long, let the walls he had built around his mind fall away. And in that moment, the connection deepened. It was like falling and flying at the same time. He could feel Zura's thoughts slipping into his, merging with his own in a way that was both exhilarating and disorienting. He saw flashes of her memories, her world, the vast expanse of stars as seen from her home planet, the faces of her people, the weight of her responsibilities. And she saw him, his childhood, his family, the battles he had fought, the loneliness he had carried with him for so long. The connection was raw, unfiltered. There were no secrets, no lies. Just the truth of who they were, laid bare before each other. "I see you," Zura whispered, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "And you are stronger than you know." Rieland's breath hitched in his throat as her words settled over him. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, but there was no fear. Only a deep, unshakable trust. "I see you too," he whispered back, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of the moment. Their minds continued to merge, the connection growing stronger with every passing second, until it felt as if they were no longer two separate beings, but one. Rieland could feel her emotions, her desires, her fears, as if they were his own. And in return, she felt the depth of his longing for connection, his hope for something more than just duty and survival. For what felt like an eternity, they stood there, their minds and souls entwined, the connection pulsing between them like a heartbeat. When Zura finally withdrew her hand, the connection remained, a bond that could not be broken. They were linked now, in ways that went beyond words or actions. "It has begun," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet certainty. Rieland opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with a newfound sense of understanding. The connection between them had only just begun, but already he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The air aboard the HFY ship had changed. It was subtle, like the way the atmosphere shifts before a storm, but Rieland felt it. There was a tension now that hadn't been there before, a quiet unease that rippled beneath the surface of the crew's otherwise calm demeanor. The deeper their mission took them into HFY territory, the more that tension seemed to grow. And it wasn't just the crew. Zura had changed too. Her sharp focus had become laced with something else, something Rieland couldn't quite pinpoint. He could feel it through their connection, a sense of apprehension that she was trying hard to conceal. Sitting in the dim glow of the command chamber, Rieland replayed their last conversation over and over in his mind. Zura had been distant, her words measured and careful, as if she were holding something back. That wasn't like her. Ever since the connection had begun to form between them, there had been a sense of honesty, of openness that had taken root between them. But now something was different. He stood, pacing the length of his quarters as he struggled to make sense of the growing disquiet. He had always prided himself on being able to read situations, to anticipate shifts in tone or atmosphere. In battle, it had saved him more times than he could count. But this wasn't a battlefield, not in the traditional sense, and the stakes were far more complex. There was a knock at the door, soft yet commanding. Rieland froze for a moment, already knowing who it would be. "Come in," he called, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and Zura stepped inside. Her presence, as always, filled the room. She was tall, her silver skin shimmering faintly in the low light, and those violet eyes of hers, usually so calm and controlled, were now clouded with something he couldn't name. She moved with her usual grace, but there was a hesitation in her steps that set Rieland on edge. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low, almost hushed. Rieland nodded, gesturing for her to sit, but Zura remained standing, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. It was a stance he recognized, a defensive posture she had adopted when she was trying to control her emotions. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone direct but not unkind. Zura's eyes met his, and for a moment she seemed to be searching for the right words. "Things are changing," she said, her voice carrying an edge of urgency. "There are forces at play here that neither of us anticipated." "I can feel it, Rieland." "I can feel it too," he admitted, taking a step closer to her. The connection between them hummed faintly, like a low pulse just beneath the surface. "But what aren't you telling me?" "You've been distant." Zura looked away, her gaze drifting toward the curved walls of the chamber as if they might offer her an escape from the truth she was trying so hard to avoid. When she spoke again, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "The Council is losing faith in this mission. They don't believe in the connection. They see it as a threat now." Rieland's heart sank. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing the words out loud made it all too real. "Why?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "We've made progress more than anyone thought possible." Zura turned back to him, her eyes filled with a sorrow that made his chest tighten. "It's not about the progress we've made. It's about what they fear we could become. The connection between us, it's stronger than they expected. Too strong. They don't understand it, and that scares them." Rieland took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "So what happens now? Do they shut it down? Do they shut us down?" For a moment, Zura was silent, and in that silence, Rieland felt the weight of her inner conflict. She was caught between two worlds, her duty to the HFY and the bond she had formed with him. And the more time passed, the more that bond deepened, pulling them together in ways that defied explanation. "They want to sever the connection," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. They believe it's dangerous, that it could destabilize everything they've worked to build. Rieland's stomach twisted. He had known this mission would be difficult, but he hadn't expected this. The connection was more than just a tool for diplomacy. It had become something deeply personal, something that had changed both of them in ways neither could have predicted. "And what do you think?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Do you believe that too?" Zura's gaze softened, and for a moment the tension between them eased. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. The warmth of her touch sent a ripple through the connection, and Rieland felt the weight of her emotions as clearly as his own. Fear, longing, conflict. "I don't want to lose this," she whispered. "I don't want to lose you." The words hung between them, heavy and fragile, and Rieland's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. He reached up, covering her hand with his own, holding her gaze with an intensity that matched the emotions swirling between them. "You won't," he said firmly, his voice steady and sure. "We'll find a way through this. Together." Zura's lips parted as if to say something more, but the words never came. Instead, she leaned in, resting her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. In that moment, the connection between them surged, stronger than ever. And Rieland knew that no matter what the council decided, no matter what forces were working against them, they would fight for this, for each other. This was the turning point. The moment when everything changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The quiet of the HFY ship seemed more profound in the aftermath of Zura's confession. In the dim glow of the command chamber, Rieland could still feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. The council's decision to sever the connection between them had cast a shadow over everything. But it wasn't the looming threat of political fallout or the mission's potential failure that gnawed at him. It was the fragility in Zura's voice when she had said, "I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." And that moment had changed everything. For weeks, they had navigated their growing bond with a sort of cautious curiosity, both hesitant to acknowledge what was truly happening between them. What had started as a formal connection, forged for the sake of diplomacy and survival, had evolved into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. But the depth of their bond had also made them vulnerable, and vulnerability was a terrifying thing, especially for Zura, who had always carried herself with the unshakable strength of a warrior. Now, for the first time, Rieland was seeing her not as the towering HFY warrior who commanded respect and fear in equal measure, but as a being who could hurt, who could doubt, who could feel lost. And in her vulnerability, he felt his own walls crumbling. They sat together in her quarters, the silence between them no longer awkward or filled with tension, but heavy with unspoken emotions. Zura sat on the floor, her long silver limbs folded beneath her in a posture that was more relaxed than he had ever seen from her. Her usually impenetrable violet eyes were downcast, focused on her hands as if they held the answers to the questions swirling in her mind. Rieland sat across from her, close but not touching, giving her space to gather her thoughts. He could sense her internal struggle through the connection that pulsed faintly between them, a low hum that seemed to mirror the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was strange how much he had come to rely on that connection, how it had become an anchor for him in a mission that had, at times, felt like it was spiraling out of control. "Do you regret it?" Zura's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. Her gaze lifted to meet his, and in those eyes he saw the rawness of her emotions laid bare. She wasn't asking about the mission, or the decisions that had led them here. She was asking about them, about the bond that had grown between them. Rieland took a slow breath, considering his words carefully. "No," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I don't regret any of it." Zura's eyes searched his, looking for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. The truth of his words seemed to calm her, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She shifted slightly, her hand resting on the cool metal floor between them, her fingers curling into the grooves of the ship's surface. "I wasn't prepared for this," she admitted, her voice quieter now, as if confessing something she had kept hidden even from herself. "I wasn't prepared for how much this would change me. I've always been able to control everything, my emotions, my actions, my thoughts. But with you," her words trailed off, but Rieland understood. With him, things had been different. The connection between them had been built on something beyond their control, something that transcended the political and military boundaries that had defined their roles on this mission. And in that connection, they had found a level of intimacy that neither of them had anticipated. "You don't have to be prepared for everything," Rieland said softly. "Sometimes it's okay to let go, to let someone else in." Zura's gaze flickered, and for a moment he saw the vulnerability in her eyes deepen. She was a warrior, trained to be strong, to show no weakness. But here, with him, she was allowing herself to be something more. She was allowing herself to be seen. "I've never been good at letting people in," she confessed, her voice barely more than a whisper. Not even with my own kind. There's always been this distance, a part of me that I keep locked away. But with you, I can't seem to do that. The connection won't let me. Raylan shifted closer, his hand resting gently over hers. The warmth of her skin was a stark contrast to the cool metal beneath them, and for a moment they simply sat there, their hands entwined, the connection between them humming softly. It wasn't just the physical contact that mattered, it was the trust that came with it. The understanding that in this moment they were both laying themselves bare, both allowing the other to see the parts of them that no one else had ever seen. "I know what that feels like," Raylan said, his voice quiet but steady. "To keep people at arm's length. To build walls so high that no one can ever reach you. I've been doing it for years." Zura looked at him, her expression softening as she listened. "Why?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. "Because it's easier," he admitted, his gaze drifting away for a moment before returning to hers. "Because if no one gets close, then they can't hurt you. They can't see the parts of you that you're afraid to show." Zura's fingers tightened around his, a silent gesture of understanding. She knew that fear, that instinct to protect oneself by keeping others at a distance. But with Raylan, that instinct had begun to erode, slowly but surely, as their bond had deepened. "Do you still feel that way?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. "About keeping people out?" Raylan smiled faintly, a rueful expression that spoke of the years he had spent guarding his heart. "I did," he said honestly, "but not anymore. Not with you." The silence that followed was thick with emotion, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a recognition of the fact that they were both navigating unfamiliar territory together. For so long they had both been alone, even when surrounded by their own people. But now, in each other, they had found a connection that made them feel less isolated, less afraid. Zura shifted again, this time leaning in closer, her forehead resting gently against his. The gesture was simple, but it was intimate in a way that words couldn't capture. It was a moment of vulnerability, of trust, and in that moment, Raylan knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges they faced, they would face it together. "I'm scared," Zura whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "Not of the mission, or the council, or even what's happening with the connection. I'm scared of what happens if I lose this, if I lose you." Raylan's heart ached at the rawness of her confession, and he pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her in a protective embrace. "You won't lose me," he promised, his voice firm and unwavering. "We'll figure this out. We'll fight for this. For us." Zura closed her eyes, her body relaxing against his as she let herself believe in his words. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't fighting alone. And in that vulnerability, in the act of allowing herself to be seen, she had found a love that was stronger than any connection she had ever known. A love forged not in strength, but in the courage to be vulnerable. The ship hummed with a quiet intensity, the vast expanse of space stretching out beyond the viewport like a dark ocean filled with distant, glimmering stars. Raylan stood there, his hands resting on the cold metal railing, watching the stars shift slowly as the ship moved through the void. It had been days since the conflict had been resolved, and yet he could still feel the echoes of everything that had happened reverberating through him. He wasn't the same person he had been when the mission started, neither of them were. Behind him, Zura approached with her characteristic quiet grace. Her presence, as always, filled the space between them with a subtle energy. There was a stillness to her now, a calm that hadn't been there when they first met. The fierce warrior who had once towered over him with an air of impenetrable strength now stood beside him as someone different. She had changed just as he had. The vulnerability they had shared had forged something new, something stronger between them. Now, the future felt like a wide, open expanse, filled with possibilities they couldn't have imagined when they first started this journey. Zura stopped beside him, her violet eyes gazing out into the same stars, her expression contemplative. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, content to simply be in each other's presence, the connection between them humming quietly, as it always did now. There was no need for words, not yet. They had both come to appreciate the silence, the way it allowed them to feel without the burden of explanations. "Are you thinking about what's next?" Zura finally asked, her voice low and steady, yet carrying an undertone of uncertainty that Raylan had come to recognize. She was no longer the being who hid her thoughts and emotions behind an impenetrable wall. He could feel her doubt, her curiosity, her tentative hope. Raylan nodded, though his eyes never left the stars. "I guess I am. Everything feels different now, doesn't it?" "Yes," she agreed softly. "It does." There was a pause as they both let the weight of that truth settle between them. Everything had changed between them, within them, and in the galaxy itself. Their connection had not only altered the course of their lives, but it had also shifted the dynamic between their species. What had started as a diplomatic mission had turned into something far more personal, far more profound. They had become a symbol of what was possible, a bridge between worlds that had once seemed so impossibly far apart. I used to think that once the mission was over, I would go back to my life, Ryland said after a moment, his voice carrying a note of reflection. Go back to the way things were before. But now he shook his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to put his thoughts into words. Now, I don't even know what before means anymore. Zura turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. There is no going back, she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with an unspoken understanding. Not for either of us. Ryland finally looked at her, and in her eyes he saw the same uncertainty, the same questioning of what lay ahead. But there was also something else, something deeper. Hope. Hope for the future, despite everything they had faced, despite the challenges still waiting for them. It was fragile, but it was real. You're right, Ryland said with a soft chuckle. There's no going back. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Zura raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. You surprise me, Ryland. Always looking forward, never back. He smiled in return, though his gaze softened as he reached out, taking her hand in his. Her fingers intertwined with his easily now, as if they had been made to fit together, despite the differences in their size and strength. Their bond was a constant presence between them, but it was more than just the connection they shared, it was the trust, the affection, the love that had grown between them in the most unlikely of circumstances. We've been through too much to let fear of the future stop us now, Ryland said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I know that whatever it is, I want to face it with you. Zura's eyes softened, and for a moment he saw a flicker of something tender pass through her normally stoic expression. She squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had shared, everything they had fought for. I want that too, she whispered. They stood there together, hand in hand, as the ship continued its journey through the stars. The future felt like a vast, uncharted landscape, a place filled with unknowns, with risks, but also with endless possibilities. Neither of them could predict what would come next, but they no longer feared it. They had each other, and that was enough. You know, Zura said after a long silence, her voice lighter now, teasing, I never thought I would be standing here, planning a future with a human. Ryland laughed, his grip tightening on her hand. And I never thought I'd be here with a HFY warrior who's saved my life more times than I can count. Zura's smile grew wider, her eyes twinkling with amusement. You are surprisingly easy to save. Hey, Ryland protested with a grin. I held my own a few times. Maybe once, she teased, her voice filled with affection. He chuckled, shaking his head. But beneath the banter, there was something deeper, something unspoken. They had both found something in each other that went beyond the mission, beyond the politics of their worlds. They had found a connection that had changed them, not just in the ways they interacted with each other, but in the way they viewed the universe itself. We're going to be okay, aren't we? Ryland asked softly, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. Zura met his gaze steadily, her expression softening into one of quiet certainty. Yes, she said simply, we will. The future beckoned, vast and unknown, but it no longer seemed so daunting. They would face it together, and that was enough. As they stood there, the stars shifting slowly in the endless black beyond the ship, Ryland knew one thing for certain: whatever the future held, they would face it not as two individuals from different worlds, but as something more, something stronger, something forged in the vulnerability they had shared and the love that had grown from it. And that, Ryland thought, was a future worth fighting for.